These are the Highlands of Scotland, one of the wildest and most precious parts of Western Europe. A vast area of hill and forest, which the Romans called Caledonia. Even today, these wild woods are the largest tracts of old forest in Britain. I was lucky to be born and brought up in northern Scotland, and have been fascinated by the Caledonian pine forests since childhood. When I was 9, I started exploring the woods and hills, and later this inspired me to study wildlife as a professional scientist. Forests are wonderful places. There's so much to see and learn. For instance, it's been known for a long time that even in early February, Scottish crossbills are preparing to breed. But only in recent years has it been discovered that they are unique. The only bird species found in Britain, but nowhere else in the world. One of the things I like about science is that it's an endless quest. The more you know, the more there is to find out. One of those crossbills is giving a call that indicates there's a nest-building hen nearby, and I think her nest is at the end of that branch. Her plumage colour is very different from the orange-red cock. She has to be well camouflaged while sitting on the nest. She builds it out of pine twigs and lines it with dry grass, sheep wool and feathers, and usually collects the twigs from close to the nest. Scottish crossbills are confined almost entirely to these ancient pine forests, and at one time must have been very common, for the trees grew over most of the Highlands. Long before that, enormous ice caps buried these hills and glens. We call it the Ice Age, but 10,000 years ago the ice melted, and the land became blanketed with a vast forest. The first trees to colonise were birch and hazel, but 6,000 years ago, Scots pine became the dominant tree, and for centuries, the great wood of Caledon provided refuge for many wild creatures. Living here were wolves, lynx, wild boar, and brown bears. Even today, an exciting remnant of these wildest of animals is still with us, the Scottish wildcat. Wary and elusive, the wildcat survives despite persecution. But most of the other large mammals have gone, driven out by man as he destroyed the forest. In most places, the trees that once covered this vast area have vanished. Centuries of axe, fire, and saw have reduced the forest to less than 1% of its natural range. Now only a few remnants are left, but even so, there are still magnificent Scots pines, and some of them, like this great veteran, are over 300 years old. These trees provide a home for some fascinating wildlife, and no creature depends more on the Scots pine than the Scottish crossbill, for its staple diet is pine seeds. So reliant are they on these that even their anatomy has become adapted. They have an extra large crossed bill for levering open the tough cones, and a long tongue to extract the seeds. Crossbills are extremely selective, and by discarding many seeds and cones, assist the tree's regeneration. Wood ants also live in partnership with the tree, using discarded pine needles to build their nests. These are shaped and positioned to face south, so the sun can warm up the colony. Temperature within the nest's network of tunnels is critical for successful breeding, so the workers build a thatched roof, and by altering its shape, they regulate the temperature. Some colonies number 500,000, with many nests 3 feet high. They're like cities. The ants help the trees by cleansing them of harmful insect pests, and hurry off into the woods to hunt. These friends of the forest dispatch themselves back and forth. You might think they're chaotic, but in fact they're very well organized, and each ant knows exactly where it's going. They carry insect food to the nest, but there are insects and insects. Just look at this one. The remarkable timberman is confined to Scottish woods and seeks dead or dying timber in which to lay its eggs. Scots pine trees, even dead ones, are essential to the survival of many creatures, not just insects, but some bird specialists, such as the crested tit. In Britain, it's confined exclusively to the pine woods of the Scottish Highlands, and it's now being studied to find out why it's so restricted. Individuals are colour-ringed for recognition, and their behaviour then recorded. In mid-April, they have to find a dead pine soft enough for excavating a nest. That's a job for the hen, while the cock stands guard nearby. By late April, the forest rings to the tapping of many specialized beaks, especially at dawn. The strange display of the world's largest grouse, the almost turkey-sized capercaillie, is a ritual that attracts hens onto the ground for mating. The display sites, called leks, are traditional, and several cocks gather to contest the right to mate. The flamboyant posturing is a show which often averts violence, but fights frequently occur and can even lead to death. The hens, with plumage that conceals them so well while nesting on the forest floor, converge on the dominant cock's display area and offer themselves for mating. Competing cocks attempt to mate with the hens and must be chased off. The dominant cock mates with the hens. Most of them will be served by him, and so ensure the fittest offspring. The hen nests usually below a tree, laying her eggs over a couple of weeks and feeding on fresh plant growth to maintain her condition. Pine needles are the main winter food and eaten by both cock and hen. The capercaillie is one of the great specialists of the ancient pine forest. But there's another grouse that also lives here, a bird of the forest edge, the black grouse. With like purpose, a ritual similar to capercaillie, blackcock display reaches its height in early May. Out in the open and absorbed by one another's posturing, black grouse must beware of predators. Some of them are large and powerful. Golden eagles are often thought of as birds of the high tops and moors, but they're equally at home in the ancient Caledonian pine forest, and grand old trees provide many traditional nest sites. Some tree nests have been used on and off for more than 100 years, with nest material standing up to 15 feet high. It's now early May, and this pair's chicks will probably have hatched, so the cock must increase his hunting. He'll fly far out over the forest and up into the hills, searching the ground for mountain hares, grouse, ptarmigan, and even an occasional fox cub. But he also hunts in the more open forest, catching rabbits and even crows, and sometimes snatching red squirrels as they dash from tree to tree. He brings the prey to the nest and tears it up for the young chick, which is about 2 weeks old. Red squirrels provide a useful meal, but eagle pairs raise more than one youngster only when prey is very abundant. Every time I see this, I'm struck by how such a large, formidable bird can feed her chick titbits with such grace and delicacy. As the chick grows, the adults break off greenery to take back to the nest. This camouflages the bare surrounds, but through the centuries, the only significant threat to eagles would have been man. Our ancestors saw all predators as a threat, and many eagles were killed, along with wolves, bears, and lynx. The last wolf was killed in 1743, and by that time most of the forest had been destroyed. But for Scottish crossbills that live nowhere else, the felling must have reduced their numbers severely. They are now one of the rarest birds in Europe. Their breeding has to coincide with a season when pine seeds are at their biggest, best, and most accessible. The cock swallows these, and he feeds the chicks and hen, regurgitating a pine meal porridge. Seed crops vary considerably, so Scottish crossbills need large areas of forest to search for food if they're to breed successfully. Remove the trees and they could become extinct. But their survival has always been a struggle. Despite camouflaging their nests in dense foliage towards the ends of high branches, crossbills are vulnerable to predators. Red squirrels are not quite the adorable creatures so often imagined, for they spend a lot of time searching for birds' nests, and if found, eat both eggs and young. But red squirrels themselves are hunted. Pine martens are agile predators, opportunists that will eat almost anything. They scour the forest for food, licking something as tiny as aphids off a pine branch, or pursuing squirrels through the trees. They spend a lot of time on the ground, catching voles and eating berries, and climb trees easily, searching out birds' nests. Hole nesters, such as coal-tits, redstarts and crested tits, are always vulnerable. But in this case, the marten seems to have found some beetle grubs. Persecution nearly exterminated pine martens, but their numbers are recovering, and they are once again widespread in the Western Highlands. They are even recolonizing the eastern forests, and this is where they're likely to prey more on red squirrels, which abound here. Youngsters like this are vulnerable to martens. This one is only 2 weeks out of the dray, and still confined to exploring nearby branches. Each squirrel home area contains several drays, and from time to time these will be visited by the youngsters. Secure though they may be, they are flea-infested. Red squirrels eat a lot of pine cones, but this youngster took a liking to these resinous growths and searched them out with great enthusiasm. Red squirrels also feed on fallen seeds and cones, but the youngster's mother is never far away and fiercely defends their food supply from strangers. Red squirrels were ousted from the southern oak and hazel woods by the North American grey squirrel. So it's the great wood of Caledon that provides a last safe refuge for this delightful creature. It's now late May in the ancient pine forests of Scotland, a time when reproduction is at its height, even for the Scots pine tree itself. The tree's male flowers are bursting with pollen, and on fine warm days, gusts of wind blow this pollen over the branches, fertilizing the little red female flowers in a creative blizzard. In 1 year's time, these red flowers will have grown into green cones. In 2 years, they will ripen to sprinkle dozens of seeds, a few of which may germinate to produce new trees. Those in open spaces do best, and in time a few may even grow to replace the ancestral pines, many of which are over 200 years old. Tree regeneration is vital to the future of the forest and all the creatures that live within it. Even when they have grown to maturity, the trees suffer attacks from insects. One of them is the caterpillar of the pine beauty moth, but it itself is attacked. One of the caterpillar's defenses is to drop off the tree, but when the wood ants close in, the end is inevitable. The workers subdue the struggling caterpillar with brute strength, then spray the victim with formic acid to immobilize it and drag it back to their nest for food. But there are other hungry mouths to feed. Crested tits now have well-grown young in their hollowed-out tree stump, and the demand for food is at its height. Broods of youngsters average 4 to 5, and their diet consists of caterpillars, spiders, moths, mosquitoes, even pine cone seeds. The hen ensures their nest is kept clean by removing all droppings a safe distance away. Predation from crows, pine martens, and red squirrels is always a threat, and the chicks stay silent when their mother's absent. The sooner these large chicks leave the nest, the better. So when they're about 2 weeks old, the hen perches close by with food and tempts them out. For chicks that have never been in the outside world before, let alone fly, this must be a daunting time. But even more so for the adults. They know the chicks must be led away from this exposed spot as soon as possible. Once away from the nest site, the chicks are encouraged to scramble up into the safety of the denser branches. Each adult looks after a different group of chicks, which separate to avoid detection by predators. As with many birds, sparrowhawks time their breeding to coincide with an abundance of readily available food. The young birds recently fledged from the nest are easy prey. With the hen sparrowhawk guarding recently hatched young, it's the cock that catches and then plucks the prey. He does this within earshot of the nest and calls the hen off for the exchange of food. The size and survival of her brood depend a lot on how well the smaller birds breed. The siskins, crested tits, coal tits, and others. If these birds raise plenty of youngsters, the sparrowhawk chicks will survive. But Caledonian pine forest has a smaller choice of prey, and less of it, than other woodland. So sparrowhawks breed at lower densities than anywhere else in the country, and each cock needs a big area of forest as a hunting domain. Some territories range from the dense forest where the hawks nest right up into the hills at 2,000 feet, where the forest peters out and only a few trees will grow. Up here, the ancient pines provide nest sites for a strange-looking bird. The goosander is a specialized duck which eats fish. It has a long, saw-edged bill, streamlined body, and large, powerful webbed feet. This female has just hatched out her eggs and now has to encourage her day-old ducklings to jump down from the security of their hollow branch and then negotiate these waterfalls and rapids. Her orange feet suggest she's only 2 years old, so this might well be the first time she's raised young. She seems anxious at the prospect of the unknown ordeal ahead. Newly hatched goosander broods average 8, but this young bird will probably raise fewer. For her ducklings to survive, she must lead them quickly downstream through the white water. The ducklings live on tiny trout, salmon and minnows, which are more abundant in the bigger streams and rivers of the forest downstream from the nest site. It's now midsummer, and the great wood rings to the song of many birds. Loch and riverside teem with insects, food for fish and birds alike. And deep in the forest, the ground sprouts carpets of flowers that thrive in association with Scots pines. There are cowberries, blaeberries, crowberries, and heather. Wood anemones bloom here in profusion, and specialist orchids, the lesser twayblade and creeping lady's tresses, reach shyly up to the sun. The delicate twin flower, a real pine specialist, spreads fragile delight across the forest floor. And in the wetter areas, bog asphodel splashes it with colour. Juniper bushes flower and fruit, providing not just food, but secure nest sites for vulnerable birds. The hen capercailzie's camouflage and immobility help ensure her nest isn't found by foxes and other predators during her 4-week incubation. But now that her chicks have hatched, they must be led away from the nest to feed. Their first foods are insects and leaves of plants, especially blaeberry, and native pine forest, with its rich ground flora, supports the best breeding success. As with most ground nesting birds, the chicks are mobile the day they hatch. But it's this very movement that attracts the attention of predators. Scottish wildcats are opportunists. They hunt largely at night, but on fine days like to pad around and sunbathe. If she comes across an unwary capper chick or a careless rodent, she won't ignore the chance of a meal. Far greater danger to capercaillie chicks is poor weather, for they easily become wet and cold in the dense vegetation and die. Capercaillie have decreased seriously in the 1980s, years with cold, wet weather during the critical week after their chicks hatch. A prolonged wet climate can even endanger the forest itself. Waterlogged ground deters regeneration and kills trees. Indeed, 2,500 years ago, a wet climate destroyed huge areas of forest and reduced the tree's upper limit by 500 feet. And all that remains of those great pines are their skeletons, buried in suffocating peat. But water has a good side. It settles in hollows left by the receding ice age, and these forest lochans are important feeding areas for several special birds. Goldeneye have recently colonised the Scottish Highlands from Scandinavia, nesting in dead hollow trees on the loch sides and raising their young on the rich insect life of the shallow water. Broods of 10 or so are normal, but can number up to 18. The chicks soon learn to dive for food like their mother, who looks after her brood and shepherds them into cover if a predatory bird moves overhead. Ospreys are no threat to the ducklings, for they live almost exclusively on live fish. The forest lochans hold many pike, trout and eels, and on fine days fishing is spectacular. He's got a fine trout, and as it's his responsibility to provide food for his mate and young, he'll take that trout back to the nest atop a dead Scots pine tree. Since ospreys recolonised Scotland from Scandinavia in the early 50s, their numbers have shot up. This nest is just one of over 50 which are now occupied. and this hen is a direct descendant of the famous Loch Garten birds. The chicks are 6 weeks old and are just 2 of over 70 young which are raised in Scotland each year. Our ospreys have been well protected by the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds and enlightened landowners, and the numerous nest sites in the forests have ensured that the return of the osprey will remain a great success story. Within a couple of weeks, these 2 chicks will fly over the Great Wood for the first time, exercising inexperienced wings in preparation for their long flight to winter in Africa. Below them, the wood ants will also be reaching the breeding climax of their year, but they have an enemy to contend with, lurking on branches near the nest. This isn't a ladybird, but a female clytra beetle, and she has a clever way of penetrating the defenses of the wood ant's nest. Upon laying an egg, she camouflages and protects it from ant attack by covering it with scales, and it ends up looking like a miniature fir cone. She then drops her egg near the wood ant's nest, and it proves irresistible to ants, possibly because of a chemical attractant. Within minutes, the enemy's egg is carried into the nest and laid down alongside the ant's eggs. Inside the nest, ant reproduction is reaching its peak. Many workers attend the queen and guard her eggs, and these eggs are the colony's future. But lying beside them, the clytra egg hatches into a carnivorous grub, protected from ant attack by a hardened case which it fashions from nest debris. From inside its mobile fortress, it preys on the wood ant's larvae and cocoons, until a year after the egg was laid, it leaves the nest as an adult beetle to start the parasite cycle all over again. But beetles have enemies too. Great spotted woodpeckers clean trees of insect pests, and some pines provide nest sites in which to raise their young. This nest contains 3 chicks which are ready to leave, so both adults feed them. The chicks are curious about the outside world, and the adults are showing them wood-boring techniques by hunting close to the nest. These nest holes are in great demand, and the wood echoes to the screams of swifts that are prospecting for next year. Swifts normally wait until nests have been vacated, but with the season well advanced, this one is over-eager. Great spotted woodpeckers are one of the last of the birds to fledge their young, and with the coming of shorter days and colder nights, the great wood signals that summer is over. It's autumn, and numerous fungi burst out of the ground. Many species live in association with the root tips of the Scots pine, or on their fallen limbs. Others live on the birches that fringe the forest and lochs. By October, the residents of the forest must prepare for hardship, for the forest is not an easy place to live, especially when daylight grows short. Red squirrels feed on fungi, but like crested tits, they store food during the summer glut and spend some of their autumn days checking and replenishing these supplies, and also eating to build up their fat reserves. As the first snows powder the surrounding hills, grey-lag geese arrive from Iceland, driven out by the Arctic chill. Forest lochs provide safe roosts, and the geese will return nightly after feeding on the local fields. But the coming of geese heralds the coming of winter. With winter comes one of the most serious threats to the Caledonian pine forest: red deer. Driven off the hills by harsh weather, they seek food and shelter in the woods and eat the young trees. And damage isn't confined just to the winter. Because of reduced forest and a doubling of deer numbers in the last 100 years, in many areas there are no young trees at all. So we must encourage regeneration. Otherwise the remnants of the great wood of Caledon will become extinct. Some of the areas that are left are protected by sympathetic landowners, conservation organisations, and new forestry policies. But collectively, it's the will of the people, through the government they elect, that will determine whether these magnificent forests survive. Only a few are left. Glenafric, Glentana, Ballachbui, Abernethy, Rothimarchus. These are some of the forests that have survived, and, let us hope, will live into the future. These forests are unique in Europe, great natural monuments to an ancestral Caledonia, and must remain a priceless part of Scotland's heritage, a living heritage.